So, good morning and welcome to Tailwinds, the podcast for Air and Space Operations Review, the operations-focused professional journal of the Department of the Air Force. I'm Dr. Laura Thurston Goodrow, and today we are pleased to host our first roundtable discussion of the podcast. We're happy to have as guests 3 of our journal authors and an expert moderator to discuss the relevance and future of U.S. Department of Defense labs and the uniformed and civilian scientists and engineers who work for the U.S. military. If you have any questions for our panelists throughout the discussion or later, please email them to asor@au.af.edu rather than using the chat function in YouTube Live. We will address as many questions as we can in the final segment of the roundtable. Again, that's asor@au.af.edu. Now to introductions. Dr. Edie Williams retired as a captain in the U.S. Navy in 2004 and served as a consultant in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, working with the DoD Labs and Mine Resistant Ambush Protected, or MRAP, vehicle program until 2018. She currently serves as the Chief Strategic Partnerships, Communications, and New Business at Parallax Advanced Research. John Fischer has over 36 years as a federal employee working in national security with the Department of the Navy, Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the Department of Homeland Security. He currently serves as principal scientist for the Energetics Technology Center of Maryland, a nonprofit research and development organization. Dr. Brian Fry recently retired as a lieutenant colonel from the U.S. Air Force after 20 years of service. He is a former assistant professor of physics at the is a former assistant professor of physics at the U.S. Air Force Academy and is currently conducting space analyses in support of national security topics. Finally, our moderator today is Bob Kavetsky. Bob is the founder and CEO of the Energetics Technology Center. He spent 32 years as an engineer in the Department of the Navy, building and operating hypersonic wind tunnels, as well as developing undersea weapons. Bob has co-authored 11 books on a wide variety of national defense-oriented topics, including 5 on defense laboratories. Edie, John, Brian, and Bob, thank you for spending time with us today. And once again, an administrative note for those joining us on YouTube Live. If you have any questions for our panelists throughout the discussion or later, please email them to asor@au.af.edu rather than using the chat function in YouTube Live. We will address as many questions as we can at the end of the roundtable.
Thanks, Laura. And actually, I didn't realize this is the inaugural podcast, so I feel doubly honored that you asked us to participate.
It's the first roundtable.
First roundtable. Okay, great. Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. As Laura mentioned, my name is Bob Kavetsky, and I'm going to be moderating this fine panel this morning. I want to make a couple of comments, and then we're going to dive right into asking the panelists a series of questions over the next 30 to 40 minutes. And then, as Laura noted, we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So with that, a little bit of background on the labs, what we call the defense labs. It's been about 100 years since the Naval Research Lab was established by Thomas Edison. He's the person that had the vision to create quote unquote, a great research laboratory to support the military. What followed was the discovery and invention of the greatest technology innovations of the 20th century. The question before us today is, do we have the right labs for the 21st century? There's a lot of really interesting work going on in the laboratory system, and a lot of thinking about what it should look like. The Defense Department right now has what we euphemistically call the labs, over 60 organizations that we're going to talk a little bit about today, which are really a combination of actual research laboratories and organizations which are much more applied engineering oriented. These labs and engineering centers are staffed with uniformed scientists and engineers, civilian scientists and engineers, and contractors and government employees that support the missions of the various services. If we are to continue to maintain a great laboratory system in the spirit of Edison's vision, the question before us is, what do we need to focus on? What structures and facilities do we need to be successful in executing our missions? And how do we attract and retain the best scientists and engineers to ensure our national security? So with that, I'm going to ask a question, and I'm going to ask a panelist who've been a little bit pre-primed on the questions to comment on the questions. So the first question before us is, what is the definition of a defense lab in the 21st century? And are we talking about the actual laboratories, Naval Research Laboratory, Army Research Laboratory, Air Force Research Laboratory, or do we also include the engineering centers in this definition? I'm going to first turn to Dr. Fischer to get his thoughts on that question. John?
Thank you, Bob. Within Title 10 statutes and DoD policy, DoD laboratories are not rigorously defined. However, each of the facilities, the research lab, the corporate research labs, and engineering centers are identified in DoD policy and National Defense Authorization Acts. These facilities are designated as science and technology reinvention labs, and that includes all the corporate research labs such as NRL, AFRL, ARL, as well as all of the engineering centers. What STRL, Science and Technology Reinvention Labs, embody is a grouping of legislative authorities and DoD policy, which authorizes DoD laboratory directors latitude in personnel and the spending of discretionary budgets. Although there's no rigorous definition, if one looks at the laboratory system in total, can see that these facilities perform science and technology, which is budget activity 6.1 through 6.3, as well as research development, test and evaluation, all the way through acquisition and direct product support. These facilities serve as a DoD tech base, not only with acquisition, but also within the basic science arena of showing what is the art of the possible. Now, an interesting note is that within Title 10, Section 188, several Department of Energy national laboratories are called out specifically. It says the Department of Defense, along with Homeland Security, Department of Energy, and the intelligence community, will ensure that the NNSA, National Nuclear Security Administration laboratories, remain technically healthy. Within DHS, Department of Homeland Security legislation, Title 6, Section 189, Department of Homeland Security has special authorization to go directly to DOE laboratories. And part of that legislation is intended to keep those laboratories technically healthy. There is nothing within Title 10 that requires the DoD to pay special attention to the DoD laboratories. Although there's a lot of legislation which authorizes directors to use authorities, again, for personnel and discretionary budget, laboratories are not required to have any special attention paid to them as far as maintaining technical health or subject matter expertise. So, over.
So I guess the question there, and I will have to say for the audience, I've known Dr. Fischer for a long time. He's a chemist. He started sounding a little bit like a lawyer in his commentary there, but probably too much time spent in the secretariat. But John, do you have an opinion on what the definition of a lab should look like in the 21st century, looking forward? I know you gave us a very good, thoughtful definition of the labs currently. Is your supposition or hypothesis that it ought to remain the same moving ahead?
No, I believe that the laboratories, to attract a highly technically skilled workforce, needs to continue supporting acquisition and the research, development, test, and evaluation mission, but also focus more on the basic and applied research elements. Okay. That's what attracts the highly skilled technical workforce, is people that can get into a laboratory, do laboratory work, and produce new innovative products.
Okay, thank you. So Dr. Williams, should the DoD, and for the audience, I'll try not to use too many acronyms, Defense Department, should the Defense Department continue to engage in research and development? And if so, what should that R&D look like, and how should we execute it?
Thanks, Bob. I think before I start down this road, for folks that are listening in or who may listen to this in the future, I think it's important to provide a couple of contextual facts. So about a half a century ago, which would have been a half a century after Thomas Edison established the first National Strategic Lab, We commandeered, the DoD commandeered, and the federal government commandeered about 2/3 of the R&D in the United States. That number has dropped now to where the federal R&D is only 25% of all the R&D in the United States. So using that as sort of a jumping off point to my logic, the next thing is to figure out, based on John's vision of what we could divide up for the 21st century. I use a logic trail that many will be familiar with called lead, leverage, watch. So if I work backwards up that triumvirate, it would be, what are things that we should just watch? In other words, I'll give some examples. 5G, 6G. If the commercial sector is interested in developing 5G, 6G, why should we be spending government dollars to do that? The second is leverage. Leverage is working with other partners. So on something like biofuels, biofuels might be of interest to the DoD, but biofuels is probably also and already being funded through other federal agencies, NSF, for example. It might also be funded through other large global nonprofits. So those are areas that we could partner in, which is what we call leverage. Now, the first one is the one that gets to the heart of the matter, which is, where do we need to lead? And when I say lead, I'm talking about engage in high risk or new emerging technology, science and technology, in that area that John talked about before, which is that 6.1 to 6.3 or S&T. Now, that's only about 15 to 16% of the current RDT&E appropriation. But if we doubled down on that and we became the leaders in those technologies, that I think would serve us well. Now, what are some historical examples of that? One I would have to say is battlefield medicine. So some have estimated that 75 to 80% of all the technology used in emergency rooms all over the United States was developed by DoD battlefield medicine. Now, that's a group that's always on the cutting edge. When we were all working together, they invented something called Quick Clot, which is a pad that has a clotting agent in it, and you put it right on the wound and it stops. Well, it's on virtually every ambulance in the United States. So in those areas where that golden hour, which is the hour between an injury happens and you save the life, or the life-saving aid of the patient goes way up in that first hour, they call it the golden hour. That's something that DoD should be very concerned about. And so that's something we should keep investing in. Another example might be hypersonics. Although we might be all flying on hypersonic aircraft from here to Europe in the next 10 to 20 years, right now, hypersonics as a weapon is something that DoD should be concerned about and should be investing
in. Okay. Thank you. So, Dr. Fry, in a number of your articles and your writing, it seems to me you've envisioned a future where military scientists and engineers are much more integrated with operations. And you also provide some historical anecdotes to illustrate that point. So what do you see as the biggest impediment to scientists and engineers assuming that kind of role?
It's I would say kind of changing the mindset of what scientists and engineers kind of do. I think there's this kind of confusion between their location versus their action. And so the idea that you can only do science and engineering in a lab kind of confines where you can actually employ, STEM. It really, yes, scientists and engineers spend a lot of time in the lab, but really the reason we're doing that is because we're just going to where the data is. But you can get data in a lot of different places. So, ideally, We would love to go to Alpha Centauri, but since we can't, we use telescopes. But we can still go to a flight line or to a battlefield or to prototypes to kind of get the data we need. And so really the action that scientists and engineers do is just a systematic way of solving technical problems. And I was trying to kind of use those historical examples to show you can actually go to different places to solve the problems rather than being confined to a very specific sterile location. And we see that throughout history, this kind of applying technical skills in different locations. So whether it's the Turtle submarine back in the Revolutionary War, or the prototype J-Stars aircraft during Desert Storm, or even something more recent where you're mounting harm missiles on MiG-29s in Ukraine. It's that taking technical expertise and going as far forward to the battlefield as possible. What I think kind of colored those events is I think they were always perceived as one-off little unicorn events that have no application to something else. And I think really what you're looking at is different facets of this kind of broader way of applying technical skills. And I think what you're starting to see now is kind of relearning those lessons and seeing that more comprehensive approach being applied into things like the Air Force's Project Doolittle or Project Arc, Task Force 99, the Air Combat Command Federal Laboratory, where you're integrating in a much broader sense of these kind of technical skills. And I think once people kind of see that difference in mindset, how you apply or where you can apply those skills, I think it'll change the mindset, and then from there it'll be, off to the races.
Mm-hmm. Can you comment, Brian, on how many military officers in the Air Force, I'm sure you know the Air Force best, actually have PhDs currently? I think the audience might find that interesting.
I think it was right around 1,000, give or take, plus or minus, 100 or so. It's been a while since I actually looked at the actual value.
Mm-hmm.
And it breaks down between, so there's about 3,200 engineers, about 400 scientists, and it's about 25% of scientists have PhDs, and I think it's about 10% of engineers have PhDs. And then there's a smattering through some of the other specialties.
Yeah. Again, for the audience, I believe that numbers in the other services are almost an order of magnitude less than that. And in this case, even though I worked for the Navy for 32 years, my dad was a career Army Sergeant Major, I think the Air Force is winning the battle in terms of the having the most highly technologically educated military officer corps. So props to the Air Force for that. Want to shift a little bit to slightly different element of the research lab question, and this one is for Dr. Fischer. What are your thoughts, John, about whether the government should have a role in the world of what we call systems engineering? And you might want to explain a little bit. I think people probably have a general sense of that, but why that's an important field and why tying the labs to research labs to systems engineering is an important topic.
Providing a bit of context, there was a time when the DoD laboratories and engineering centers developed products, developed the technical data packages, and those data packages were put out on contract to the contractor community. In 1986, the Reagan administration sponsored the Packard Commission with the goal of improving the acquisition processes. What came out of that commission were a series of legislative changes to Title X, which occurred in the late 80s, early 90s, which shifted the systems engineering role, technology development role to the contractor community. What that did was essentially took the DoD laboratory system out of the acquisition process directly. What the DoD laboratory system does now in acquisition is approve the work packages, approve the contractual recommendations and changes, et cetera, of the contractor community. And what this does is it shifts the product liability from the contractors to the DoD laboratories, the laboratory personnel and program management offices, an extremely important function. However, the DoD Labs no longer have a critical role in the systems engineering process, and that is pulling together various technologies to develop that final product. What I would recommend we consider is not that the DoD laboratory system assumes the system contractor role, but rather a system contractor role. And this would be in partnership with the contractor community, with the defense industrial base. So for example, stealing a page out of the National Institutes of Health playbook, the National Institutes of Health do almost all of the S&T R&D in new pharmaceutical medical technology development for the US pharmaceutical and medical technology industry. There is a close partnership where when NIH develops a promising new drug or vaccine or technology, in partnership with the pharmaceutical community, that new product is transferred over to the pharmaceutical industry for final development and transition. If the DoD laboratory community could develop a relationship with the industrial base such that R&D products out of the DoD labs were transferred with appropriate intellectual property protection and such to the DoD industrial base, now there's a shared technology, a shared vision, a shared product. And the DoD laboratory community could do upfront systems engineering, where the contractor community, the industrial base, would do that final systems engineering to meet the contractual requirements of their acquisition program. There's a secondary effect of this, and that is when the DoD laboratories look to hire personnel. So going back to one of my first comments, technical personnel would rather be in a laboratory doing hands-on work versus reviewing engineering change proposals, et cetera. So if the DoD lab community and the contractor communities could develop a closer partnership, share that systems engineering responsibility, I believe that it would be much easier for the DoD lab world to not only attract and recruit and hire technical personnel, subject matter experts, but there would also be an improvement in retention of highly technical, skilled personnel. So again, right, we went from all DoD contractor, all DoD labs to all DoD contractor. If we could come to a compromise position in the middle where it's a shared responsibility, I think everybody would benefit. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, that's probably particularly germane, not exclusively to the world of software development. I think there's so many DoD systems now that are like systems out there in a lot of other arenas other than the defense world that are really relying upon software. And for the DoD to have a more central role in terms of providing open platforms for vendors and make sure their software platforms can talk to each other is certainly a role that you would think you'd want the government to play. So Dr. Williams, I'd like to ask you about the role, if any, that facilities play in the world of research. I think we all know that they do play a role, and any particularly current examples that you'd like to highlight about the role of facilities in attracting talent and also solving big problems that the Defense Department has.
Sure. I think connecting back to what I said earlier about lead leverage watch and figuring out what facilities and what resources meaning facilities, people, and money that you need. I'm going to harken back to a term that gives us all a shudder, which is BRAC. So the series of BRAC, for those that are younger than 40 years of age, is Base Realignment and Closure Act. And it allowed the DoD over a period of decades to look at what they had, evaluate what they think they need moving forward, and then close down and redouble their efforts and rebuild certain facilities. If we did something similar to the lab system based on that lead leverage watch analysis, then things like, I'll go back to my hypersonics example, hypersonics wind tunnels. So there was a report recently in the last 2 years done about what are the facilities available for hypersonics development in the United States. And the report concluded that we were woefully inadequate. So if we went through a larger BRAC-like exercise of what we have, and we moved to John's idea of sharing the responsibilities with the DIB, the Defense Industrial Base, coming to a happy medium using some facilities they have, some facilities we have, and then redoubling our efforts on the facilities for those things we want to lead in, then I think we would all come out stronger and healthier. Now, shifting to the workforce argument, back to what Brian was saying, I think the Air Force, I would guess, has a larger uniformed scientist and engineer S&E community because of when they were created. So the Air Force was created after World War II. We were in a technology development phase. We were getting ready to go through a boom in technology development. And I think the Army Air Corps, which turned into the Air Force, rightly understood that technology would be leading the way into the future. And that having the scientists and engineers in uniform gave that link back to the operational forces. And actually, Brian had some really good ideas in his article about how we could go back now and do some of those things where we embed S&Es in the operational forces. And before I flip it over to Brian, going back to one thing that John said is, in general, scientists and engineers, I call beakers and Bunsen burners and engineers with their slide rules, they want to be on the bench doing bench level science and engineering. And I think if we provide more opportunities for them to do that, I think we would be able to attract and retain, which is where the big problem is, high quality talent. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brian to talk about some of the examples he had in his article about how uniformed S&Es can embed with operational forces to do revolutionary and evolutionary innovation.
I'll just plus one to Edie's and John's comments. I would say scientists and engineers are looking for tough, important problems that they can make a contribution to. So if and I think that's kind of a key to retaining that kind of talent, is you give them a problem that they can't tackle anywhere else. And I think that's really attractive. And I think what you might be seeing with, at least on the uniform side, if not on the civilian side, is if kind of the labs or just the kind of S&E kind of structure that the uniformed members are kind of placed in, is if they're only in sort of a quality control kind of peer review, but they don't do as much hands-on, I think that kind of lowers that desirability, because they're not necessarily tackling the problem, they're just sort of watching it kind of take place. And one of the downsides to that is kind of technical skills atrophy when you don't use them. Just like, if you don't work out, you're not going to be as fit. And so kind of retaining and practicing those kind of bringing all those elements of contractor, civilian, military, those experiences together would really, again, it just amplify the amount of expertise that you're applying to different problems. So
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, so I think I want to shift gears a little bit and talk. It's going to sound like a sterile topic, alternative governance, but that's what I'm really wanting to get your thoughts on is, are we organized and managed the way we should be to have a successful defense research and defense lab structure going into the 21st century? And again, there's right now, in my view, we have a hodgepodge of government laboratories, which are real labs and engineering centers. We have things called federally funded research and development centers, FFRDCs. We have things called university affiliated research centers. So we have a really interesting mix of organizational constructs that execute a lot of the R&D work for the Defense Department. And so I want to ask each of you to comment on your thoughts about, if you were king or queen for a day, what structure would you put in place to make sure that the defense enterprise had the right research organizational approach? So John, I'm going to put you on the hot seat first.
Within the current DoD laboratory system, there are 3 distinct funding models. Navy, Army, Air Force each uses their own funding model, which fits the overall strategic vision of their service. Outside of the DoD laboratory system, there are 2 other big business models. One is, as Bob said, federally funded research and development centers. An example there is MIT Lincoln Laboratories. The other one is university affiliated research centers. Biggest example there is Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Labs. If one were to look at the laboratory models outside the DoD, for example, MIT Lincoln Labs and Johns Hopkins APL, one would see laboratories that are very well equipped, have an extremely high quality workforce, and have substantial budgets. And within the Department of Defense, budget is a key metric. So there are other models that have been shown to work very, very well. Outside the Department of Defense, we have the Department of Energy's national laboratories, which are government-owned contractor-operated facilities, GOCOs, and also federally funded research and development centers. And if one looks at the metrics of performance out of the DOE labs, again, one would see a very high quality workforce, very productive in the world of science and technology, as well as research, development, test, and engineering. And the DOE labs especially garner just incredible amounts of kudos, awards, et cetera, from organizations that recognize their technical expertise. So it's difficult to say, is there one size that fits all? But what would I think be of high value is to look at the DoD laboratory models and say, why within the Department of Defense, what is the need out of these laboratories? And then look at alternative models such as FFRDCs, UORCs, and GOCOs, and look at, could these other models or a hybrid of these models improve the mission performance of the DoD labs? Very much open questions, but I think worthy of study. Thank you.
So I think you're saying it is not a one size fits all, and it probably goes to Dr. Williams' point about the lead, leverage, or follow construct too, as far as what you would do to, what sort of structure you'd implement to, in the particular technology domains. For instance, in our domain, John, the one you and I work in, energetics, that's almost exclusively a DoD area. There's no real commercial market for explosives, propellants, pyrotechnics, other than commercial mining. And so in that particular area, we probably need to be leading in that one. The DoD needs to be leading because nobody else is going to lead in that one. So Dr. Williams, your thoughts on alternative governance and models that you either find interesting or experiments you see going on currently within the Defense Department and looking at alternative models. And just to prime the pump there a little bit, I'm thinking of models like Naval X, AFWorks, Open Campus, things like that, that are each of the services are trying out, if you will.
I think to answer your first question first, the model that I like and that aligns with the lead leverage watch example is HRL Labs. Used to be the old Hughes Research Lab out in California. The couple things I like about them. Number one is they've used that lead leverage watch to focus on just a few things. So they have 3 or 4 areas that they focus on. And every 3 to 5 years, I can't remember which, they reevaluate the whole thing and say, okay, what 3 to 5 areas are we going to focus on moving forward? And so they're not trying to do everything. They're only trying to do 3 or 4 things, but be the leader in those 3 or 4 things. Now, what does that do for your workforce? What it does is it attracts the best of the best. They get the best of the best students, doctoral students, postdocs in those disciplines, because those students and those professors know that if Brian is my #1 student and he wants to work in the #1 lab in the United States, I'm going to get him hooked up with HRL. Now, in Brian's case, he's already at the #1 lab at MIT. That's just one example that I like to go back to. But to your question about NavalX and AFWorks and those sorts of things, I see them as more innovation focused than I do laboratory focused. So I think those efforts are trying to tap into commercial areas of innovation. And I actually personally believe that there's an underlying assumption there that commercial industry has more innovative people than DoD does. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think that somebody told somebody in leadership that if we want innovation, we've got to go outside DoD to find it. And I think that's where all of those programs have sprung from. But moving forward, if I were queen for a day, maybe we use those programs to go out and figure out where do we lead, leverage, watch. I mean, maybe they're part of that equation.
Interesting. Thank you. So, Dr. Fry, your thoughts on governance?
So I'll probably shift a little focus here. So my kind of interest is technical adaptation. So how do you adapt to a changing face of conflict? And so I think we've seen in like the Ukraine situation, this kind of change between capacity versus capability, the invest to divest or vice versa. And so in sometimes I would see like the traditional acquisition structure as geared really well towards building capacity, and the DoD Labs or the R&D is kind of building a capability. But what I think is kind of missing is some kind of in-between place where you have actually focus on adapting and changing, and trying to understand this very dynamic situation and kind of what's needed. It's sort of being able to tell what capabilities do you need and what capacity. And it's something I kind of think this, either what I focus very much on the military S&Es is kind of being really ideally suited for that. Kind of that, the ubiquitous valley of death between operations and technology. I kind of viewed military S&Es as kind of meant to be within that valley itself. So contractor and civilian would be great to join in. I thought it was something that the military S&Es were particularly leveraged against. And so being able to make this kind of adaptation to change and kind of rendezvous with reality and go on from there was something that was kind of focused as kind of a different governance model. So you have this these kind of 3 things: capability, capacity, and then what capabilities do you need and capacity of that adaptation. So,
Okay.
So
Thank you.
sorry, I was maybe a little rambling
No,
there. So
actually,
sorry about that.
No, I think Brian, what you did, speaking a little bit tongue in cheek, is you used a politician's approach to answering the question. You just said whatever you wanted to talk about. You didn't answer my question, but that's okay. This is
I'm sorry.
a free form.
Yeah,
No,
you can
fine.
govern that way, I guess. You know, so
that's true. Yeah. So I do have a question. I'll give a little bit of context for the question for the panelists, and I'm going to go in reverse order this time, not and so it's going to be Brian, Edie, and then John. So I'm not always picking on John first. So actually 10 years ago now, Dr. Tim Coffey, who is the director of the Naval Research Lab, and Dr. Steve Ramberg, who at the time was chief scientist of ONR, wrote a piece in the National Defense University that I thought was fairly prescient looking back on their writings of 10 years ago. And they were arguing that they thought the labs, now I'm really talking about the research organizations, not the engineering centers, needed to actually triple in size to maintain awareness of what's happening globally in the world of science and engineering. And so I'd like you to comment on the awareness piece, because clearly we have not tripled the size of the labs.
Mhm.
And should we be tripling or increasing the size of the labs? If not, are there creative solutions to maintain that awareness that don't require tripling the size of the labs? So Dr. Fry, let's go to you first for your observations on that. And please, this time, answer that question.
Okay, all right. I'll check back in to make sure I actually did. Yeah, so I thought their connection or their description was very interesting, where the kind of the global R&D market is vastly expanding, and the amount of fingers you have in that kind of pot is sort of a limiting factor. I would say, probably speaking to it from my perspective, it's something I touched on in the articles, was a lot of Air Force scientists and engineers, when they go to graduate school, the vast majority of them go to a single graduate school, Air Force Institute of Technology or Naval Postgraduate School. So they're both fantastic institutions, so I'm not denigrating them at all. But it also limits your touch points on that sort of global R&D market, or ecosystem, however you want to describe it. And so what I would see is, one, trying to expand where our scientists and engineers attend graduate school, so they can not only get a more diverse perspective, but also meet globally those different scientists, engineers, those different perspectives, those different research focuses, or foci. Anyway, and then also making sure they maintain their own individual research projects. So they get out there, they go to conferences, they build their kind of collaborative network. So they're not just very insular on their only DoD office cubicle farm. Yeah. So, does that answer your question this time?
No, yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Dr. Williams, your thoughts on quote unquote technological awareness?
I think the hypothesis that they came to 10 years ago was correct in some ways and not correct in others. So I'm going to go back again to my lead leverage watch example. Mm-hmm. If we continue to try to do everything, yes, we need to get bigger and we need to continue. But I don't think we need to do that. I think we need to pare down and do those things that we really need to be doing. And we need to do them in the new environment, which is now dominated by commercial R&D, not federal R&D. Mm-hmm. Now, one area that I'm currently working in is workforce development for microelectronics. As everybody knows, the CHIPS Act was passed. There's a lot of work in the United States right now to reshore microelectronics. Now, within the field of microelectronics, some would argue, okay, well, let the commercial industry lead there and just watch. But within microelectronics, there are things that just the DoD federal government should be doing and should only be doing. You might call out rad hard. You might call out trusted and assured microelectronics. I'm reading a book of fiction from one of my favorite authors, where the Russians want to move into Ukraine, and the first thing they do is shut down communications all across the United States and Europe. So there are things within a particular technology area, so sub-technology areas, if you will, that we would still need to lead in. And so I think innovative public-private partnerships would be another way to get to John's idea of coming to a symbiotic relationship between the DoD, the DIB,
Mhm,
and commercial industry, in this example, Intel.
mhm. Okay, yeah, thank you. Dr. Fischer, your thoughts on technological awareness?
One of the fiscal realities within the Department of Defense is that within any organization, if budgets get tight, when budgets get tight, travel budgets are cut, training budgets are cut, things which apparently appear mundane, technical journals, technical libraries gets cut because there's no perception of what's the immediate effect. Well, the problem is with cutting in those areas, there's a long-term effect, and it comes down to awareness. So it's important that organizations have subscriptions to journals and such, but again, I'm speaking from personal experience here. There is nothing, absolutely nothing that beats one human being standing in front of another talking. And going to conferences where, again, with Zoom and MS Teams, those are certainly incredible tools which we need to use more of. But also people need to be encouraged, perhaps required, to go to technical conferences. And the other part of this is actually go to facilities that are doing work. So it might not necessarily be going to university, but perhaps a DoD lab person goes to a contractor, and equally as important is vice versa.
Mhm.
People need to know each other. People need to get to know each other at a personal level. So if one were to look across the tech base at the moment, especially with people who are senior in careers, you will hear them talk more often than not about their network. And that network was created over many years of going to conferences, going to meetings, visiting people back and forth. We've lost, my opinion, we have lost a lot of that now, especially COVID, that has changed the playing field. And again, it's not a one size fits all. There's a hybrid answer in there someplace. But again, human beings to human beings is where the real technology transfer, learning transfer occurs. And we need to encourage more of that rather than less. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, that's a good segue into my final question. It's going to be sort of a lightning round, and we have about 6 minutes left. But so if you're, and we're going to start with you again, Brian, and go Brian, Edie, and John. So if you're to define an attribute or two of this future lab system, what would that attribute be? I think John was just saying, person-to-person contact with people outside your agency, which I'm in violent agreement with. So, so Brian, thoughts on attributes or features of this new lab system that you think are really important? You're on mute. You're on mute, by the way, Brian.
Thanks.
Mhm.
All right. I would say probably just whatever, it's what makes a good research organization is a focus on learning, and trying to, like, I think failure is probably a little harsh description, but trying things and see what works and what doesn't, and sort of enforcing that, encouraging that, and instilling that as kind of a cultural kind of thing, so that the focus on kind of learning.
Right. Okay. Thanks. Edie?
I'm going to riff off Brian's comment and say that I think the most important thing is our young scientists and engineers, and giving them a sense of risk-taking, innovative thinking, creative thinking. One thing that I think we should do is an experiment that we did with one of the AFRL directorates, where we took the junior scientists and engineers and made them do the 5-year strategic plan. So they were essentially planning out their own future. Like, what areas are we going to invest in the next 5 years? Well, they all were doe-eyed at first, but once they rolled their sleeves up and And we gave them full access to senior leadership, who normally does that sort of strategic planning. But once they rolled their sleeves up, they were all in. They were all over the literature. They had just recently, within a couple of years, come out of academia. So they were more apt to be in touch with the literature as well. But that's just one idea of an attribute that historically we've fallen off, or I'd say in the last half century, we've fallen off, in addition to John's comment about conferences. But that's an example of what might bring us back.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very interesting. I jotted a note down about that for my own organization. That should we let the quote unquote the kids run the asylum for a while? I don't know if I'm quite ready to jump off that bridge yet, but Dr. Fischer, thoughts on?
If I could implement one change, it would be across the defense tech base, and this includes in-house workforce and contractor workforce and the military workforce that are in the world of science and technology. So for example, those Air Force officers that Brian described, create amongst that group a shared vision. And what I mean by that is one group doesn't provide approval for another, one group doesn't submit documentation for approval by the other, but rather everybody is working towards the same common goal because everybody has a say in the final decision. So again, getting back to what's the best model for that business model, that is TBD. But reduce the competition amongst those three elements and bring in a system that would actually encourage collaboration and cooperation amongst those three groups of people, I think would benefit everybody involved. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So with our last 2 minutes, I'm going to go again another lightning round. Just, is there anything I didn't ask you that you said, boy, I wish Bob had asked me this, and this is something I want to comment on. So Brian, any closing thoughts or stray neurons that fired in a different direction that you want to give us a closing thought?
No, I think I already just put in my little pet project idea. So that's, so no, just thank you very much for having me. I love talking about scientists, engineers. So this was awesome. So
yeah. We all do too. Dr. Williams?
I think I'd like to put in another plug for innovative public-private partnerships. And an area that you have to figure out is IP. I know when I was at ONR and you were ONR with me, this was a couple of decades ago, but we went from 6 to 8 IP attorneys down to 1. And in the 21st century, we live in a world of IP. So we've got to figure out the IP. And once we can talk openly about IP, then we enhance those public-private partnerships.
Good point. So Dr. Fischer, closing thought?
Nothing additional. And I'd like to thank everybody for allowing me to participate in the conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks. So Laura, with that, I believe I'm going to declare victory for this particular roundtable. And thank you, Brian, Edie, and John for your time and your very insightful commentary. And hopefully the audience found that moderately interesting and useful. Laura, over to you.
Bob, thank you so much for moderating. And Brian, Edie, and John, thank you for a really interesting conversation. I'm excited about sharing it later on our website and on our social media, and hopefully get some more feedback. And I enjoyed the discussion. I thought the initial question we kind of asked was the DoD Labs situated for 21st century warfare. And I think the answer is complicated and we have a lot of work to do. So, but again, I really appreciate your participation today and being willing to be part of this. So I hope you all have a great rest of your January and Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.